Hey, Dave, who are you and why are you here?
I just graduated from a master's program in the humanities, and I went in there knowing that I would do my work on Persik. Ended up comparing Persik and William James in my thesis.
And Dave has been a periodic poster on partiallyexaminedlife.com among the discussion sections, and I had always been excited and impressed by the things you put up. And I think when I put out a query for potential guests some time ago, that you informed me, you actually met the guy, right?
I did. I like to say I'm the luckiest amateur philosopher in the world. I was invited over to Liverpool. It was kind of a graduation party for the guy who got the world's first PhD in Robert Pirsig's philosophy. I owe a lot to this guy, Anthony McWatt. Pirsig sort of invited himself to this thing, and then it evolved into an amateur philosophy conference. And, I got another call, would you like to write a paper? And so a bunch of us did that. It was kind of had a very amateur feel to it. But anyway, I just happened to get lucky, and I connected with him and chatted with him and had beers with him, and we've been in contact ever since. He helped me through, and mostly by keeping me from wild goose chases and whatnot. He's been very kind, very supportive, and I'm just thrilled to know the guy.
That's cool.
He's kind of a hermit,
But he's actually pleasant to talk to?
Yeah, he's, in the book, he makes himself out to be a madman, but that's not really true. That's kind of just a dramatization, really.
Well, the only reason I ask is because the famous philosophers I've met, it's been a sort of hit and miss about whether they're tolerable human beings or not.
Maybe it was just the mellifluous tones of the guy who read the audiobook that I listened to that I am projecting onto the actual Robert Pirsig. But I would expect him to be pretty cool. But I do have to do a little digression here and say, who are the famous philosophers that Dylan has run into that he's hit or missed on?
Well, when I was an undergrad, I studied a lot of Richard Rorty, and I got the chance to meet him at a conference that was at Michigan State when I was there, and tried to spend some time because I was really interested in what he had to say. I'd spent a lot of time reading his books and was interested in his ideas about science and nature. I was ending my undergrad work, and I was planning at that time already going on into physics, but spending a lot of time on philosophy. And when you would read him, he spends a lot of time talking about conversation and stuff like that. He was absolutely non-conversational at all. He was, one of my colleagues at St. John's had called him lugubrious. And he was in no way opened any kind of conversation with this young undergraduate. I had to work as hard as I have ever had to work with the most naive and recalcitrant undergrad myself as a professor just to try to get him to say anything. He always had one-word answers. It was a big contrast to my expectations.
Pirsig sounds like in his book, and not even just in the one that we read, but I scanned through the first 150 pages or so of his follow-up work, Lila. And in that one, too, it's like the other characters don't like him, and he characterizes himself and through their eyes as, somebody that just is not a good conversationalist and is cold and distant and etc.
The character in the Zen book is a huge prick.
Do you really think he's that much of a prick in the book?
I think there are times that he comes across that way.
Yeah.
Dragging, 11-year-old?
Something like that.
11-year-old son, dragging him across country on the back of a motorcycle and being totally unsympathetic to his whining.
It is not how I would design a father and son a vacation myself. I used to do that with my dad, and we'd go to the Indiana Dunes campground, just the two of us for a night or two, and go to the beach, and he'd let me buy ho-hos and read Mad magazines and stuff like that. Not, what, you sit in the back seat, and I'm just going to think. It does talk about him reading books of philosophy or something aloud to, or what was it?
Walden.
Yes,
but it fails. He admits it fails, right? It doesn't work.
But it sounds like it's a regular thing that they do. There's this whole intellectual connection that is not expounded upon.
But there are also numerous scenes where the kid is off outside the campfire and he's like, I want to do this. And father's like, the main character's like, no, just go to sleep. We're not doing that. There's a lot of times where he won't even talk about things. He won't even respond to him. Maybe we should get into the relationship between the father and the son. Or maybe that's the secret to the book. I don't know.
One of the posters on the website mentioned the unreliable narrator. And I think this explains a lot about your complaints. I mean, what the deal is that Phaedrus is the real guy. And the narrator is sort of this bullshitter, people pleaser He just wants to stay out of the psych hospital. He's just going to do everything he can to appear normal because he wants to avoid the psych hospital, the electroshock therapy. This is a nightmare, and he doesn't want to have anything to do with that ever again. And so he develops this fake personality. His son just knows sort of intuitively that this is fake and wrong, and I'm not happy. My real dad disappeared a few years ago, and I want him back. And so that's the tension in their relationship.
Yes, and we should say for people that haven't read this, and we're going to spoil what little plot there is. It's not really that important, frankly.
Right. They all die in the end.
Exactly. They died in a motorcycle accident with Camus. So the thing is a memoir while the guy is driving his son cross country, but the whole backstory, some of which he reveals, he's sort of giving his intellectual history. And so part of this intellectual history is he studied some philosophy and he taught at a university, rhetoric and et cetera. But then he basically had a mental breakdown. And so all this is happening after he went through this electroshock treatment, which he says erased his personality, essentially, made him into a different person. So he refers to his earlier self as Phaedrus. It's halfway through the book before it's even clear that he's talking about himself. And then he doesn't really admit that it is the same personality or doesn't feel like that until pretty much the end.
I would call the book an intellectual biography. And then his intellectual life is divided into two parts, before and after the electroshock therapy. And this really happened. He was tested like a 170 IQ. He went to college when he was 14. He was studying chemistry and physics and things like that. And he got real stuck on the question of where is the foundation of science. What I expected, he's 14 years old, what I expected before I came here to college was to find like the truth, the scientific truth. And what I'm discovering instead is that there's an endless proliferation of hypotheses for any set of data. There's no end to it. So how do you know which is the right hypothesis? How do you know even what to test? His 14-year-old mind just kind of can't handle this, and he's neglecting his homework, and he flunks out, and then when he's old enough, he joins the army, encounters some interesting people over in Korea who expose him for the first time in his life to some Eastern ideas. All the way back on the troop ship, he's reading F.S.C. Northrup's The Meeting of the East and West, and this changed his life. When he got back, he re-enrolled in college, and now he's going to study philosophy and not science. He even goes to India to study Eastern philosophy. He gets no answers there. And he finally gives up all these big questions he has about, what's true and what's right and how should we live. He gives up on all that as a young middle-aged man with a couple of kids. And this is when he goes to Bozeman to teach rhetoric. So by the time he gets there, he's forgotten about all that stuff. He's just settling into a comfortable middle-class lifestyle. And then this colleague of his asks him, are you teaching your students quality? He's a teacher of rhetoric, a teacher of composition 101, it's just freshmen. But because of his background, this question just blows his mind. And then this leads him to quit his job at Bozeman, and he goes to Chicago to study philosophy at the PhD level, to study the ancients, Plato and Aristotle and whatnot. And that's when he finally sort of reaches the answer that he's been looking for. That's when either he goes insane and has a psychotic event, or he has an enlightenment experience, depending on how you look at it, depending on how you want to interpret it. And Pirsig himself says that he will not dispute either interpretation.
It's pitched in the book that the psychotic break was a direct result of the ideas involved.
Mm-hmm.
That they're so revolutionary and so mind-blowing that his mind was actually blown. And I find that it seemed like a bit of rhetorical drama to me. It didn't. That
exactly.
is not the way mental illness actually works. You can get obsessed about certain, and he sounds like this at other points in the book, that now I can consider these ideas with a cool head and just kind of thresh out their philosophical implications. But back then I just fixed on this thing and just couldn't let it go, and it just occluded everything else. And clearly that's not a result of the idea itself then, because it's the same idea in both places, but it's what the mind that is grasping it is doing.
It's not clear to me that he doesn't struggle with getting obsessed by the idea again at the end. But I do want to say that part of the book, it's a big book. There's sort of interspersed current time descriptions of the journey with his son and with this other couple, with these recollections about Phaedrus as he builds up the history and explains. It's almost two stories interwoven. But the part where other teacher asks him if he's teaching quality, and he takes that question so seriously, and it becomes this issue for him, I actually found that very charming and compelling.
Yeah, it's interesting, too, because he's not sort of going to the textbooks or the history of philosophy to grapple with the traditional questions and problems and issues. This issue just comes up in the course of his work life. You know, he goes through a practical phase where he kind of works that out in the classroom. What does that mean in terms of writing essays? And then he goes into this philosophical phase where he's studying at the university. And then he goes into this mystical phase. And this is where we're supposed to believe, where the insanity comes in. He comes to the conclusion, late after the second book in discussions that his work is a version of the perennial philosophy, which is a kind of non-theistic mysticism when he gets to that final phase.
So we've talked about that on some of our episodes as the sort of apophatic moment. Every religion has a sort of a mystical branch or a mystical strain in it, such that, for instance, God is just so huge that there's nothing we can even say about him, and that even the word God is just a symbol, is an abstraction. But the truth of the religion is just something that is so primal and huge that all we can really do is sort of stand in awe of it and see how that affects our lives.
Maybe we should rewind a little bit and kind of build up to it. So we have kind of the outline of the story of the book. So let's talk a little bit about how he gets caught up in the idea of what it means to be teaching quality and why this becomes such a problem for him.
I have a suggestion to get at that question, which involves rewinding a little bit to just say a little bit about the very beginning of the journey, which would get to why the word motorcycle and maintenance is in the beginning, is in the title.
Okay, sure.
The tie for me to that experience in Bozeman and the question of quality is brought up in sort of example in the discussion about tuning motorcycles and the way in which he engages in it and thinks about it and reflects on his own experience with it and what is good and bad about it, alongside his friend John, who sort of refuses to do such things. And he frames this whole thing from the big picture view in this sort of romantic versus classical view, contrasting a kind of intuitive versus scientific. He has a number of buzzwords, jargony words about it. But what I found compelling was he was right about the way in which you pay attention to a machine. And I guess for me, it was the way in which he was attentive in a particular way to the behavior and the operation of it, with, on the one hand, a motion towards understanding and manipulating, but not with a point of view of conquering. So it was a displacement from the, sort of the Baconian or Cartesian notion of science as conquering nature and making it submit to your intellect. But it came hand in hand with an understanding of manipulation and technique that was also coupled with a genuine sense of listening and attentiveness to sort of what was going on. Both those things at the same time. I read this book before I started riding motorcycles, and then read it again after I started riding motorcycles, and then I read it again most recently. And I find that his description of that kind of interaction with the technical world and the way in which you are a successful mechanic was right on. And I think that has a lot to do with both the bridge that he wants to pose between science and philosophy and the way in which we interact with the world as a thing outside of ourselves, but also have an intellect with respect to.
I want to try to explain a little of the context there before. I guess the initial problem that's posed is this alienation that people often feel, especially in the hippie age when this was written. And I guess the ride itself was supposed to be taking place in 1968. So it was very much buck the system, whatever. He uses the hip versus square.
That was the year of my birth, baby.
It was the year of my birth, too.
So he's talking about his friends that he's riding with and their technophobia, that's the way that they react to this being in a world with things that you no longer understand. He's saying, no, you can still be groovy and understand the technical details as well. In fact, it's a whole wonderland that is open to you. The beauty of the structure of something is just as groovy as the surface appearance is. It's kind of like the difference between letting the beat of a song just carry you and grooving it on that way and listening for how all the structure of the different instruments work together. The analysis doesn't have to ruin the experience for you. In fact, you can make it all the more rich. Yeah, no, I thought you would be into this, Dylan. I was not surprised that you had read this multiple times because Dylan, who is my brother-in-law, so I have some personal insight into his behavior, but this guy will like redo his kitchen himself, redo his porch himself. I can replace batteries on things. Like but I see you as a guy that is just not afraid to unalienate himself from the tools around him.
Well, thank you.
Alienation is definitely the thing he's trying to counter here. He's talking about this identifying with the thing, which really kind of just means that you really give a shit. If you can't fix this thing, you're going to feel bad about it because you love the thing and you want to go someplace on it. And of course, the bike is just a metaphor for everything that you work on.
And I would stress not just the working on, but the attentiveness, the maintenance part of it. Right. So a big deal at the beginning of this book is the way in which he talks about the conflict between him and John taking care of their machines. And then you also read in the narrative about just his activity of doing this. He's riding along and he hears the sound of it. It just doesn't sound quite right. And he needs to make a judgment. Well, is that not sounding quite right because, well, we're at a higher altitude? And so the motorcycle is running the way it's supposed to, but it's sounding different because it's in a different environment. Or are the tappets loose because it actually needs to be tuned up differently? And should I manipulate it or give it some adjustment because I am at a higher altitude? That attentiveness to its own activity is what I find compelling. And the way he phrases it is my experience with the way any good mechanic actually behaves, or any good carpenter actually behaves, is a kind of constant feedback and listening to attentiveness to the activity. So when you hear a carpenter or sculptor talk about the sculpture came out of the stone, it's a kind of attentiveness to what fits for that particular situation. So, and a carpenter or a mechanic, they'll walk into your house or have your car drive up. They'll say, oh, that's running really good. Or that sounds like your carburetor's running a little bit rich. Or they'll notice things about the way your house is constructed. And that's just part of their attentiveness to their surroundings. And that becomes even heightened when they're actually partaking of that activity.
And it's important too, Dylan, that he's making an argument in favor of this attentiveness being available to us through technology.
Yes.
That in order to be attuned to things, you have to go back to nature. And he's saying, no, you can be attuned to technology. Technology is part of the organic structure of things.
You shouldn't be willfully ignorant. You're not going to be a better mechanic by imagining that the carburetor is like a woman and you're going to make love to the carburetor and therefore you'll understand it, right?
Is that how you understand women?
No, what I'm thinking of is it's a common trope for musicians in my experience about the kind of way in which you groove on learning how to play the instrument and you attend to it the way you would attend to a woman because it's a kind of sexual mystical experience. And there's an attentiveness, but it's not one, as you're pointing out, it's not absent technology and techne in the sense of a artful application of practical knowledge.
This is the classic and romantic that he plays with throughout the text. And it's also the theoretic and the aesthetic. Those are the two main categories that he learned from Northrop, the meaning of the East and West. This is a guy from Yale, by the way, a pretty underrated dude. And Persik says that, his book, Zen and the Art, is basically a popularization of Northrop's difficult book, which is just a huge monster of a thing. I've never read it. But he's popularizing something very specific. If you want to know the real meat and potatoes of what this guy is saying, you go read Northrop. There's no reason to like his buddy John and like so many people in that era who were, dressing like Indians and wanting to live in teepees and stuff like that. That is a total rejection of technology and intellect. There's something profoundly anti-intellectual about that. And he's trying to say that's a symptom of a problem. And the problem is real. We got a cultural crisis going on here because there is something terribly square about our ways of thinking, about our technology, about our science. It's something so square that it's alienating. It makes a lot of people very unhappy. They feel overwhelmed and out of control, and there's all these things everywhere they go that they don't understand. But he's saying running from that is not the way to go. He felt, because of his scientific background, that he could face this problem and come up with a solution.
We were talking about attentiveness. You could picture a very different story coming out of this, where he's talking about the attentiveness that he pays to his son and his companions and how he's so in tune to their needs and things. And I find it interesting that the way he's talking about this attentiveness, I understand it both on a romantic and classical levels and can merge those two, that those do not apply easily to people. Somebody who is like a psychoanalyst doesn't necessarily relate better to their child because they can understand them on an analytical level, and sort of merging that with the affective. Those are just clearly very different things.
I sort of disagree, actually. I think that he understands, well, I mean, I guess we have the story only from his perspective, and it would make a difference to have it from Chris's perspective. And I'd have to think about whether or not he always misjudges what he should be doing. I mean, there are times when Chris just throws a tantrum, so he ignores the tantrum and lets the kid deal with it.
The fact the book records the thoughts doesn't mean that that's all that was necessarily going on in the interactions between them. So you can't really draw that conclusion. But still, the fact is that he says he has trouble relating to other people, and that's what a lot of the story is about.
When the book ends, it's the triumphant ending, supposedly, is when Chris finally, the son, asks him, "Were you really insane?" And the narrator answers for the first time ever, "No, I wasn't. I wasn't insane. And, everything I said was true." And at that point, he allows Chris to get back on the motorcycle, this time without the helmet. And this time, he doesn't even have to sit down. Chris is standing up as they're winding through the redwoods. And he realizes that, this poor kid has just been staring at the back of my helmet through the whole trip. Of course he's not having a good time. But now he's got this helmet off and the air is blowing through his hair and he's smelling everything and he can see up ahead, what's coming in the road. He's got the perspective of the driver for the first time instead of the back of somebody's coat and helmet. And so this is, I think, when the narrator finally sort of gives up that fraudulent personality and confesses, "No, I'm just doing this to stay out of the hospital, and he wasn't insane, and I believed what he said, and blah, blah." That's when Chris can sort of have some peace. That's when he gets his father back.
Maybe we should actually get to what his view of quality is. So we already talked about it as this indefinable, mystical thing that happens before any sort of analysis of experience. And we gave a few of the comparisons of that to Eastern and some of the Western folks, but he has much more to say about it than that, because, just the fact that he calls it quality, it means it's not just this inexpressible thing. It has a value, a positive value or a negative value. And I was a little unclear. The word quality, he seems to talk about it like it's just a yes-no rating like that. But there's also the word qualia, with the qualitative character of things, which you could say, you get an overall sense, which is not just a yay or nay. It's a very complicated, even if you don't want to say like it's broken into parts. It's unanalyzed, right? Do you think there's support in his writings that he definitely just means yay or nay, or could it be something else?
It's kind of like the unanalyzed totality is aesthetically charged, as you say, positive or negative. This is really good. And then you figure out why it's really good later, upon reflection.
But is it just the positive or negative, or does it have a character more specific than that?
You can't put your finger on it and articulate it, but it's a very specific feeling tone. Like I say, aesthetically charged. There's all kinds of grades in there. It's not just good or bad. It's all kinds of feelings.
So it does have more than just a positive or negative, though it does have that. It has lots of other characteristics. It's just you can't pick them out because it's unanalyzed, right? You don't know it by its properties. It's just something you experience directly.
Right. And I think the idea is, in the case of motorcycle maintenance or whatever else that you're working on, is you're not really seeing it or hearing it exactly, but you're in touch with this. You're following the quality. And, this doesn't exclude thought. And when I say it's unanalyzed or pre-intellectual, I don't mean that there's a total absence of thought. But the front edge of your experience is sort of what's dominating.
Could I read I have a quote from chapter 20 on what you're saying, if that's all right?
Please.
Text? What are you?
He says, this is in chapter 20, at the cutting edge of time, there must be a kind of non-intellectual awareness, which he called awareness of quality. You can't be aware that you've seen a tree until after you've seen the tree, and between the instant of vision and instant of awareness, there must be a time lag. The past exists only in our memories, the future only in our plans, the present is our only reality. The tree that you are aware of intellectually, because of that small time lag, is always in the past and therefore is always unreal. Any intellectually conceived object is always in the past and therefore unreal. Reality is always the moment of vision before the intellectualization takes place. There is no other reality. Since all intellectually identifiable things must emerge from this pre-intellectual reality, quality is the parent, the source of all subjects and objects. And there's a lot stuffed into there. Everything that we say we see or hear is already, he says, in the past. It is already involves an intellectual component, which other philosophers we've read have put that as something like there's no such thing as unconceptualized experience or something like that. All experience is of something in particular. I have experienced this tree. Okay, well, that means the concept of tree and the concept of spatial object and all this stuff is already built into that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he's denying that. He's saying, yes, that's what thinking is about, but a key part of experience, moment to moment, in fact, the key part of experience is this pre-intellectual stuff. Yeah, I'm not sure I buy that.
Well, Here's the thing, though. He works his way into it, though. The conversation starts, at least from my perspective, it starts with epistemology. He has the entire class write essays, and then he reads the essays to the entire class. He's asking all of these quote-unquote naive freshman rhetoric students, can you tell which of these are good and which of these are bad? Which of these have quality and which of these don't have quality? And they can. The students know which are good essays and which are bad essays. And then he says, okay, well, why are these good and why are these bad? And this is where the problem comes into play. They're unable to reach a definition or a set of criteria which are coherent and consistent across all of the cases to say, this is what makes a good essay and this is what doesn't. And yet they are able to identify it. And this is kind of the source of the conundrum.
Well, he convinces the students that they do know what quality is, even though they can't define it, through that exercise that you mentioned exactly. And so once he's got them convinced of that, then all he has to say is, well, your goal is to write an excellent essay. And they say, well, how do I do that? I don't know how to do that. And he says, yeah, you do. You know exactly what excellent is. He wants to reverse the priority. He wants the aesthetic to come before the theoretic. He even says at one point that, in my opinion, all the rules of grammar and essay writing, all the criteria that's supposed to be a mark of great literature, all this stuff was invented after the fact. First, there was the great writing, and then people develop rules from that. The primary thing is the excellence that everybody recognizes, even if they can't say why. And then some people can work out why. In fact, there's this pithy little quote. What does he say? First you get the feeling, then you figure out why.
I agree that there would be a kind of, for lack of a better term, a pre-intellectual experience. But it's utterly key, isn't it, that the writing comes before the formulation of a strict set of rules about it. And it turns out that set of rules ends up being a kind of pale reflection of the original. It doesn't capture the richness of that original material. There's experience embedded in there in some way, your experience with literature. On the face of it, while I understand the notion that, well, these students, they know what quality is. They know what the quality of these essays are, and they can judge it by pointing out to it. And you see the evidence of it because there's a kind of general ascension about it. Okay, I can buy that. But if I ask them all to go judge whether or not, well, let's just say a motorcycle is operating correctly, they're not going to be able to do that unless they get some experience with that. They're going to have to go take it for a ride. They're going to have to do all kinds of things and gather experience with it. And then maybe based upon that, they're going to formulate a judgment about that quality. But it seems to me there's got to be something happening, and it's not clear to me that it's exactly pre-intellectual about processing that experience. And maybe that's what he means by the quality, but it's not clear to me that it's as simple as it being manifest in, oh, any freshman can judge whether it's good writing or not. Because that has, along with it, a whole bunch of baggage about their own experience with writing.
Which he admits. But yeah, I have trouble also reconciling that with the notion that these judgments are pre-intellectual. You have to recognize that it is an essay in order to judge that it's a good essay. You have to understand the language. There's so many things intellectually that are going into before this judgment comes up that to say this has anything to do with the pre-intellectual just seems strange to me.
This is an excellent point. I've heard this objection many times, and I don't know if I've really come up with a very good reply to it. But there's a point where he uses a train as an analogy for the difference between theoretic knowledge, the things that you know, conceptual ideas and all that stuff, and then this pre-intellectual cutting-edge experience. He asks us to imagine a huge freight train moving across the landscape, and this thing is like a mile long, and all the boxcars are filled with all the concepts that we've inherited from the past, that we inherit from the language, the context of our culture. And that freight, that's got a lot of momentum, a lot of weight behind it. But at the cutting edge of that train, that's the pre-intellectual experience. And there's something about that whole train behind the front edge that informs the way you take the present moment. In other words, the present moment, that dynamic cutting edge of experience, that pre-intellectual experience, is well funded, not only by your own personal experience, but also by the collective experience of the culture in which you learn to think and speak. So you have a mile-long train full of freight, and that always comes to bear on the present moment. Like you say, a motorcycle mechanic, he's got to know how to use the tools, he's got to know what the shape of this machine is, what it can do on the road. He's got to have a lot of experience with motorcycles and machines to be a good enough motorcycle repairman to be considered an artist. That's what he's trying to do is, raise even that kind of seemingly mundane task to the level of an art by being engaged in it, identifying with it.
And that sounds right, but it's not clear to me that the way in which it cleaves is between intellectual and pre-intellectual. It might be a refinement of the intellectual and all the stuff we've mentioned about attentiveness, or the way in which you understand your engagement and the status of that engagement with the external world and your experience and the contingency of that. That may all take a different tenor, maybe, than other ways of speaking about it. But it seems to me that it's ripe for the objection that is somehow a refinement of intellectual experience and not a pointing to something that is non-intellectual. That, whatever this sort of sixth sense is, it's something that comes out of mind and comes out of our being that's at least aside from or alongside our sort of rote psychochemical experiences of like our eyes and our ears and our noses.
I'm going to try to avoid name dropping, but the reason I wanted to go back to this idea of how it comes organically out of the epistemology is that what I thought of first when I was reading this was Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein has this idea in the later works that he talks about game and trying to define what a game is. Everybody can identify, everybody can see whether or not something is a game, but when you try to actually define and set down the rules for what counts as a game and what doesn't, it becomes somewhat difficult. So what I thought when I first read this part about the students being able to identify something but not being able to define exactly what it was, I wasn't thinking so much in terms of concept, preconcept, and what gets onto the metaphysics, but more about that it was somehow linguistic, or that experiential knowledge versus what we would consider, traditional knowledge, something like that.
It seems to me that Wittgenstein and Pirsig are both making an anti-essentialist move. This idea that, a thing can only be that certain thing, and there's an essential meaning that, things just are what they are, and our task is to find out what they are. But Pirsig is saying, and I think Wittgenstein is saying, language doesn't work like that.
It doesn't map onto pre-established substances or something like that.
Right.
Pre-established categories.
It doesn't match onto the way reality is already carved out, some pre-existing ontology that we don't have any particular access to, and we're trying to find out what's really real. And I think Pirsig, for sure, is saying, no, definitions are just abstractions. They're just what we find most salient about a whole series of experiences. There is no essence of anything. There's no true nature of anything. We're making this up as we go along. We're inventing all this stuff. We invent the concepts and the words, and they're pale by comparison to the experience from which they're abstracted. The real reality is so much richer than words and abstractions and ideas.
And he extends that to concepts like space and time, or at least space. He talks specifically about Poincaré and his dealing with non-Euclidean geometry. So you might think that we have this sort of self-evident experience of space, and so mathematicians, geometers can abstract from that and create some axioms that have to hold or something. Gives the example of the discovery of, you could have non-Euclidean geometries where parallel lines, in fact, do meet at infinity as opposed to going on forever and not meeting. And there's nothing inconsistent about that. And so the world itself underdetermines its various abstractions, that you can always come up with more than one description of these things. So don't think that any concept, even such a basic one and seemingly codifiable one as space, can be captured like this. And you could do something similar, I think, with the concept of number. If you listen to our Russell on mathematics episode, I mean, you can consider numbers as sets. You could get into the different types of numbers. Even that, there's a lot of room for different theories of these supposedly self-evident things about experience.
Yeah, in that moment, he's talking about two new geometries in addition to the traditional, Newtonian three-dimensional space, the commonsensical geometry where parallel lines never intersect and all that stuff. There's two alternatives, and they work in their own domains. And at that point, he says, geometry is not true so much as it's convenient. It's useful. It gets you somewhere. This is the most pragmatic moment in his first book, where he's saying that, the truth and value and validity of an idea is its ability to function in your experience. Does it work? And obviously these alternative geometries were actually doing some real work in physics. It's beyond my understanding, but
I'm going to refer listeners to our William James episodes that we did a while back on the meaning of truth for discussion of this in general. But what about, let's see what specifically Persik has to add to this.
I was thinking that the way Pirsig would add to it, it just goes back to this key term of quality, that this is going to be the vector along which you're going to make distinctions and have them stick. And I was trying to sort out for myself what the content of that naming of that distinction as quality is. So when you use that kind of pragmatist language and say that you're going to make a distinction between it working and not working, it seems to me that Pirsig calls that fittingness, that appropriateness, that the thing that you're really making the distinction based on is what he's going to call quality. Even if we want to try to cling to something about it being ephemeral is the wrong word. I think he would steadfastly say that it's not ephemeral, it's not transitory exactly. It might be hard to get a hold of because it's not essential and it's not substantial. But it's nonetheless the characteristic that we have to make these distinctions. I'm trying to figure out the words to get across why quality is the word that he wants to pick. I mean, I assume it is just a way of saying a difference between better and worse.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of, at the end of the day, when you're making a judgment about something, that this is better and worse, it's more fitting and not fitting, that's the way this word quality is operating. And as David was saying, it fits in with all your experience, all your cultural baggage, all those things all together.
And I know we've made the point in a number of ways in different discussions of the relation between fact and value in terms of no analysis of facts is going to give you a goal. even if you say these two puzzle pieces fit together just right, you don't care unless you want to fit the puzzle pieces together. Why you would even call it fitness at all is because there's some sort of preconception of an aesthetic desire that these look good together, or we're trying to achieve something with that, or something like that. There's always some quality judgment that is prior to your analysis of the facts. He really gets it down to an ontological level, that the fact that I call this a puzzle piece and this a puzzle piece, as opposed to referring to the background behind them, or the piece of lint that's over to the side, what we pick out as objects at all is going to be a pragmatic matter. It's going to be a judgment of quality, according to him.
Actually, this gets really complicated. William James was a psychologist, as you probably know, before he became a philosopher. And he and Persik both get into this idea that there's a pre-selection process that goes on, that you select what to notice from the flux of experience, this overwhelming, over-buzzing, blooming confusion of experience. And so there's huge parts of reality that you never even become consciously aware of because they have no value to you. They don't make any difference to you, which is kind of a weird idea, that there's, I don't know what percentage of reality is filtered out by our eyes, for example. There's only a certain segment of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can see. And
that's different from it being irrelevant to us. That's not the same issue at all.
Well, that's true, but the idea is that certain things are just beyond the very organs of perception, frustrate our ability to truly perceive reality in its totality, that we're always going to be limited by our concepts as well as our sense organs.
Isn't it a better example than something like what our sense organs don't see would be the things that we're embedded in, and we're so embedded in them as to ignore them, like the air, or gravitational attraction, or our country.
Our own bodies, yeah.
Our own bodies. I mean, all those things that we are utterly embedded in that we don't pay attention to, usually until we strike up against some kind of boundary that forces us to then pay attention to them. So we leave our country, then we begin to reflect on our own country. And when maybe we're ill, we begin to think about our healthfulness, and that it's upon those transitions that we become aware that there's a difference. And I guess in Pirsig's language, we'd say, well, there's a difference in quality. We've gathered an experience that allows us to make a distinction between this and that, and we're going to make some classifications isn't quite the right word, but some distinctions of quality and distinctions in general. And they may not have hard and fast categories yet, but they will have differences of quality that we will point to and reflect on and factor into our experience, and then that will educate our future experience.
Well, most of what you just said was Heidegger speak, right? That there's this background.
Okay.
Yes, it's this background of conditions that we are living in. You don't notice the tool until the tool malfunctions. You don't notice your hand until your hand hurts or is not doing what it's supposed to do. You don't notice gravity until you have a run-in with it. I don't see how Pirsig's notion of quality helps to clarify that insight. So this is, again, Heidegger's example, that if I'm using the hammer successfully, I don't notice it. It's only when the hammer breaks that my attention focuses on it. Well, I mean, you could say, okay, because a bad quality thing happened there or something, and so I noticed it. But actually, that goes right against what we were just saying before, that we notice the things that have good quality. In fact, he sort of tries to generalize this notion of quality to be a complete metaphysical, we don't even need the notion of causation anymore, because we could just think of it in terms of quality. To say A causes B, you could say B as a positive quality assessment of A or something. In other words, when A happens, B tends to show up as well, because there's a quality relation there. If you're going to be that expansive about this notion of quality, it really should do something, and it has to be in some way linkable back to what it is in our experience, right, of seeing something as good or bad. And I don't see that here, even in the hammer example.
You don't really need to get reflective or think in terms of abstractions if you're operating unproblematically. If everything is smooth and works, it's sort of all just taken for granted. When the hammerhead falls off, or when you all of a sudden realize that there's a contradiction in your thinking, it doesn't have to be a tangible physical thing, of course. You sort of crash, and then you're forced to reflect. Dewey talked about that, where thinking is where you're taken out of the stream of experience for a while. And you have to look down on where you were and what went wrong. And the smoothness of operation is sort of the natural sweet spot to be in. Thinking is really about solving problems that we encounter when that experience is not smooth.
I'm trying to figure out whether you've answered my question or not, because you kind of just restated the same Heidegger point, but you certainly stated it in terms that sound like what Pirsig would say. What I'm trying to picture is just this notion of, again, back to the basic act of perception, that I divide some perception up analytically, partly out of habit, of course, right? We see things as subjects and objects out of habit. But he seems to think that we notice the things we do for some quality reason. That just seems that that's not a powerful enough way of explaining the way perception works, right? Object recognition comes out of usefulness. So I guess then we have to analyze the hammer example is when it breaks, it then becomes useful for us to actually consider the hammer because we didn't have to before. It was not necessary. It was not useful for us to be focusing on the hammer, to be self-conscious about it because it was going smoothly, but now we have to. So it is a quality distinction. It's just, it makes sense put in terms of utility, but I didn't use the word quality there. Unless you want to just say utility and quality are identical, in which case he's adding nothing at all to the pragmatists, and I'm not convinced of that either.